Morning everybody, and welcome to the 9th meeting of this year of Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Remember to switch off your mobile phones, etc. They can affect the sound system. Agenda item 1 today is a decision on taking business in private. First item is to decide whether to take consideration of agenda items 3 and 4 in private. 3 is a consideration of the evidence on the CAP and SRDP, and 4 is consideration of a draft response to the Procedure Committee's inquiry into the legislation process. Are we agreed? Yeah. Thank you very much. The committee is also asked if it agrees to take consideration of its work programme in private at its next meeting. Are we agreed? Yeah. Thank you. Excellent. Right, we can move on to agenda item 2, the Scottish Government's implementation of the Common Agriculture Policy and Scotland's Rural Development Programme 2014-20. This allows members to take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary on the Scottish Government's implementation of the CAP, and we welcome Cabinet Secretary Richard Lochhead and his officials, David Barnes, Deputy Director Agriculture and Rural Development, and Drew Sloan, the Chief Agricultural Officer, Dr Jenny Johnson, Policy and Advice Manager in SNH, and ask the Cabinet Secretary to give an opening statement. Good morning, Richard.
Thank you very much, and good morning to the committee. It's good to be here to discuss what, of course, is a huge issue for our rural communities and for farming and food in Scotland, which is the implementation of the new Common Agricultural Policy from 2015 to 2020. I don't have a written statement as such. I'd just like to make a few opening remarks. The committee will, of course, be pretty familiar, I expect, of the journey we've travelled to get here so far, and the CAP regulations were adopted in December of 2013 and then published by Europe in January. In terms of how the Scottish Government approached these negotiations, clearly we've always wanted the best outcome for Scotland, given the distinctive nature of Scottish agriculture in this country, and therefore we've always sought the ability to tailor to a reasonable degree how we implement the policy in this country to take into account the fact that we have our own distinctive geography, different sectors, uplands, lowlands, island, mainland, and our climatic conditions and additional challenges to take into account. So now we face the big challenge of how we take forward the implementation of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. The consultation on the future of Pillar 2 has closed, the Rural Development Programme, and we're currently considering the responses we received. And of course the consultation for Pillar 1, the direct payments, closes at the end of this week. I did of course extend the consultation by 2 weeks, given it wasn't going to make any difference to the overall timescale, so I felt giving an extra couple of weeks, given some of the ongoing debates around the country, was worthwhile. So the consultation now closes this Friday. Although I'm having a public meeting in my own constituency with my local farmers on Monday, so I may take into account what they say as well. But there's to be ongoing dialogue with all sectors and trade associations throughout the whole of April as well, before I hope to take decisions throughout May and June. And therefore, by the end of June, we'll be in a position to have announced what the implementation of the new CAP will be in Scotland. Some of the specific issues we did pursue during negotiations, again, the committee will be familiar with. That includes issues such as ensuring we can bring new entrants into the policy, because one of the big controversies was how new entrants into agriculture through the course of the current CAP were effectively frozen out of the payments. And I think everyone accepts that's unfair, untenable, and we had to ensure that new entrants were catered for in the new policy. And not just that, but people entering agriculture throughout the next policy should not face disadvantages new entrants in the existing policy faced. We want to make sure there's an ongoing mechanism to give support to new entrants throughout the new policy. So we're pleased that we have achieved that and taken big steps forward. Other issues, of course, related to tackling slipper farming in Scotland, which is an issue. Doesn't account for an enormous proportion of payments going to slipper farmers, but the fact that we still have slipper farmers and payments going to some farmers who are not that particularly active was, of course, controversial. We negotiated the Scottish Clause, and we're now looking at how we can implement that in Scotland. And as you know, we've had various discussions with the European Commission as to how we can interpret the Scottish Clause and actually put it into detailed rules within the new policy. So no doubt that was something you want to touch upon during our conversation today. But of course, the big picture is that we are having some radical changes to the implementation of the policy in Scotland by moving from historic to area payments. And that will, of course, impact on many recipients throughout the whole of the country. And although I don't like the phrase winners and losers, the fact that we are having such a transformation from historic payments to area payments, there will be, of course, differences in the payments that many farmers receive. The break with production and headage payments will now, of course, be taken forward. We had an extra few years of having the historic system in Scotland. Other countries moved to area payments earlier than us, so therefore the changes will be quite stark for many recipients in Scotland. But given that I'm determined to link support with activity as much as possible, we are looking at how we can mitigate the impact of reductions in payments for those farmers who are still genuinely active. And of course that's at the heart of how we take the policy forward, and no doubt will be at the heart of the debate we have today. And overall, of course, my objective is to ensure that Scotland remains a food-producing country, that our farmers and crofters are able to produce the raw materials that underpins our very successful food and drink industry in this country and puts food on our tables and takes into account the need for modern societies, in my view, to address issues such as food security, which I think is going to become a greater issue in the decades ahead. And I think Scotland should be at the forefront of the debate over food security. And likewise, parallel with that debate is how we produce food sustainably and minimise the impact on our environment, particularly at a time when we want to increase more food in the decades ahead for future generations. So of course that in itself is a big challenge as well. So our farmers, crofters, look after our landscapes, put food on our table. We want to ensure that continues and that the new Common Agricultural Policy supports that, and indeed Pillar 2 supports wider rural development measures and environment and forestry measures at the same time. So big challenges there. We have not finished our consultation yet, so what I'd say today, clearly, I'll go as far as I can to give an indication of where I think the direction of travel is going in their areas, but because we're still in the middle of a consultation, I can't give final decisions, as you'll understand, on many of the issues. So I look forward to the discussion and questions this morning.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. You've decided to transfer 9.5% of the Pillar 1 budget to Pillar 2. And since Scotland has the lowest Pillar 2 budget per hectare in the EU, why not transfer the full amount to boost the budget as much as possible?
Okay. Well, clearly, one of the earliest decisions I had to take because of the timescale laid down by Europe was the rate of transfer from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2, or indeed vice versa. As you know, I've announced 9.5% transfer from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2. Because our Pillar 2 fund, as you quite rightly say, Convener, is the lowest in Europe, I didn't think there was any case for transferring Pillar 2 to Pillar 1. But likewise, our Pillar 1 budget, as you all know, is also the lowest in Europe. It's the third lowest under this cap and is now likely to be the lowest, or certain to be the lowest overall in the whole of Europe for the next cap that we're discussing today. Therefore, whilst I was receiving representations to maximise the transfer from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2, because the Pillar 2 budget was low, and of course a very important budget, likewise, because the Pillar 1 budget is low, I felt that I couldn't go for the maximum transfer, as some people are arguing, because of the difficult budget decisions we already face in Pillar 1, and therefore taking the maximum out of Pillar 1 for rural development, I felt would place many farming enterprises in Scotland at a disadvantage because they are reliant on direct support through Pillar 1. So I guess a combination of having to strike a balance where I was having representation to maximise the transfer and I was in representations to minimise the transfer, with the fact that our Pillar 1 budget is already too low, and the fact that in Scotland we have farming businesses that are reliant on Pillar 1 direct support, and I therefore had to take into account the impact on these businesses if I maximise the transfer. I settled the figure of 9.5%. And I guess because both sides of the debate were very unhappy, maybe I got it right. So it was a difficult decision, but to be fair, even though perhaps the representations I was receiving weren't satisfied, I think many people do accept it was a fair balance.
Andrew Midgley gave us evidence from Scottish Land and Estates, supporting the 9.5% transfer from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2. But he believed that, it could be revisited at the earliest opportunity, which he reckoned was 2016. Are you minded to review the level of transfer at any time in the near future? once you've made the final decision?
In answering that question, I don't think you can divorce it from the overall debate over budgets. And if the budgets were to change over the course of the next CAP, then clearly there would be perhaps some grounds for reviewing that. But at the moment, I've not taken a decision to review the transfer rate. But I've not ruled it out, but I don't have a specific proposal to review it. I'll ask David Barnes to remind me what the regulations say in terms of when we can notify about reviewing. So I think it might be quite an important point to understand what we're allowed by the regulations.
Yes, happily. Two things to say. Firstly, I think the convener talked about the final decision, as in the initial decision. That deadline is passed. That was the deadline for there was the end of 2013. So the Cabinet Secretary's decision of 9.5% is not something that's still subject to final confirmation. That is the officially notified position. And secondly, yes, the regulation gives a one-off opportunity. So it's not that the Cabinet Secretary would be free to review the transfer rate whenever he chose, but the regulation gives a one-off opportunity to review the rate, but only to put it up. So the Cabinet Secretary, were he to take that opportunity, would have the option of increasing the transfer, but the option of reducing the rate of transfer is not permitted in the regulation.
Have you had any recent discussions about this in Brussels?
In terms of the transfer rate or?
Transfer rates.
No, I have not had any specific discussions on revisiting the transfer rate with Brussels, because clearly we have the option to return to that at a later date, and having just taken the decision in the last 2 or 3 months, it's premature to start raising that in Brussels, given the number of other issues we've been raising with Brussels over the last few months in terms of slipper farming and other issues we've had to iron out, which has been more of a priority. The other issue, of course, I should mention in terms of deciding the transfer rate is the message I've tried to convey to the industry and indeed this committee in the past, which we shouldn't look at Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 as unrelated. They are both funding pillars that benefit Scottish agriculture, and therefore it's not as if Pillar 1, as some people have tried to portray it, is removing resource from agriculture and putting it into other sectors in Pillar 2, because of course around 2/3 of the funding of Pillar 2 benefits Scottish agriculture, not least the LFAS payments, Less Favoured Area scheme, which of course is the biggest element of Pillar 2, representing around 1/3 of the budget. So to fund that farming scheme of LFAS, which is £65.5 million per year, we need the transfer from Pillar 1 to make sure that was sustainable.
Indeed. Graham Day.
If I may, just for clarity, Cabinet Secretary, is it the case that whatever figure that you transfer from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 can and normally does attract match funding from the Scottish Government? If that's the case, has a decision made on to what extent you'll match fund?
Well, yes, in that there's match funding in Pillar 2, so the transfer figure, of course, is just a figure of the proportion of the budget. It's not for specific purposes, but it ups the budget for Pillar 2, which we can then allocate according to the consultation we've had. And of course, we laid it in the consultation supporting the continuation of LFAS, as I just mentioned. So I think it would be unlikely the consultation has persuaded us to not continue LFAS, but we are taking into account the responses we've received. And the different rates of match funding change for different budget headings within Pillar 2. And yes, we will be match funding, and yes, we have the Scottish budget available, and I think the figures were in the consultation document.
So what I'm driving at is, had you decided to modulate to a greater extent, that would obviously have had then significant potentially financial consequences for the general Scottish Government budget, because you would have had to find more money from that to match the transfer figure. Is that the case?
Theoretically, we can, because we will have 6 years or so to put the Pillar 2 budget through, the rates of what we call down from Europe in terms of the European element of the funds can change from year to year, and therefore in theory what we submit from the Scottish budget into Pillar 2 can also change from year to year. So you have to look at it as a 6 or 7 year budget. It's a lot easier to look at it that way as opposed to an annual budget. So there's not a direct correlation in terms of what your question.
I will move on to transition to area payments. Angus MacDonald.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. As you'll be aware, there's been some concern raised about the transition from historic to area payments. However, it's fair to say that, that there have been a range of views submitted to the committee. Also, as you're aware, the PAC report, for example, recommended that the transition to area payments with additional coupled payments should be introduced as soon as possible. And the committee also heard from around table discussions that there's absolutely no appetite whatsoever for the Irish Tunnel approach. Why should, given that concern, why should the move to area payments not happen straight away?
So that question, of course, relates to one of the big decisions to be taken in terms of implementation, which is the transition and the pace of transition between 2015 and 2019-20 as we move from historic to area payments. So clearly, the first principle is that we have to have a transition because basing payments from 2015 onwards, and the later you get, the more untenable it becomes, is indefensible if it's based on what the activity levels were back in potentially the 1990s, when farmers were receiving headage payments, which then in turn influenced the historic levels of payments were decided in this cap in the early 2000s, which they're still receiving today in 2014. So therefore, to cut a long story short, the longer the transition, you could find yourself in a position where you're in the early 2020s, basing payments on activity farmers were carrying out back in the 1990s. And I think that is completely untenable. However, we have three options. We can do the overnight transition as you suggest, or we can do a slower transition over the course of the new policy, or we could use the Irish Tunnel, which means there's no full transition by the end of this policy. In the consultation, I proposed the middle option of using this cap as a transition period, but not going beyond that, so everyone is on the level playing field by 2019. So your question was, why not go for the overnight transition? Well, clearly because we've been slower in Scotland moving from historic to area payments, the steep decline in payments will be very acute for many recipients in Scotland. Therefore, if we were to do an overnight transition, in theory, and it varies from farm to farm across Scotland, you could be implementing an overnight reduction in payment on active farms of 30, 40, maybe more %. And that is disruptive. It could harm Scotland's production levels in terms of food. We're very reliant, for instance, on the beef sector. As you know, we have 27% of the UK's beef herd in Scotland. It's disproportionately important. And we must also think about these decisions not just in the context of the primary producer, but also Scotland's ability to produce food, and secondly also on all the auxiliary industries that employ people in our communities, in the hauliers, the livestock haulier sector, in the meat processing factories. Therefore, if we were to inflict a huge hit potentially on farming businesses and production was cut severely overnight, that would have a big economic impact, as well as on the critical mass we need in Scotland to produce food for red meat products, also when I'm talking the livestock sector. So that's all the issues I'm trying to take into account, and that's why I went for that particular option in the consultation.
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. It certainly seems to me to be the best option, and the majority of respondents seem to think that. Could I perhaps move on to the new payment system that's due to be introduced? As we know, the new payment system introduced in England between 2005 and 2012 created a few difficulties, to say the least, with the House of Commons Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee describing the saga as a catastrophe for some farmers and a serious and embarrassing failure for DEFRA. Can I ask what preparations have been made by the Scottish Government, Rural Payments and Inspectorate Division to introduce a new payment system, and are there any lessons that we can learn from the fiasco that we saw down south between 2005 and 2012?
Well, clearly, the situation south of the border was well documented. The first lesson we should learn is to understand how we have to be on top of this situation in Scotland to avoid some of the pitfalls other countries have experienced when it's been implemented, the transition from historic to area payments. So we've got a team working hard in the Scottish Government on the new system. We're rebuilding the IT systems, which is a very costly, huge exercise, but because we are implementing these changes in Scotland, we have to do it, because we have a very old IT system in Scotland. So we are having work already underway, preparing for the new system, but clearly until we have the final decisions taken, and of course we had to wait a long time to get the regulations from Europe to understand what the boundary was of what we could implement in Scotland. You know, we can't design a full system until we know these decisions, but the work is already underway. So we're confident it will be ready in time for 2015. We clearly recognise it's a huge challenge, and the more complex we make the decisions, you know, the bigger the challenge will be in having the system ready in time. So we do have that at the back of our minds. I know that some stakeholders and commentators have been accusing me of basing the policy on what's easiest to implement. Well, that's not the case. We'll do what's right for Scottish agriculture, but of course we have to take into account the practicalities of implementing many complex different regulations in Scotland. So we have to bear in mind, as we discuss all the various options that stakeholders want us to discuss, that some will have more impact on our ability to deliver in time than others. So we have to take that into account, but it's not the deciding factor. All I can do is give the committee an assurance that we're throwing everything at this. We're confident it will be ready in time for 2015. We've got a year, we've got more than a year to get the forms out for those to apply under the new system, and then I've got December 2015 for actual payments to be issued. So we're working flat out on that.
Supplementaries on that. Right. Looking at direct payments still to new entrants, young farmers and activity issues, how is the government going to define activity to stop payments going to slipper farmers?
So one of the biggest controversies of the current Common Agricultural Policy has been the payments to farmers who have reduced their activity dramatically, or indeed some would class as effectively inactive over the last few years. And we, as you know, in common parlance have referred to people as slipper farmers, who effectively are not particularly active farmers, but collecting payments nevertheless as if they were active farmers. And that's effectively due to the loopholes in the system that was introduced under the existing cap a few years ago. The biggest loophole was the ability for farmers to transfer payments they're receiving in good quality grounds for past activity, which clearly were quite high payments, to keep those entitlements to receive those payments, but attach the entitlements to cheap land they rent in other parts of Scotland, which gives them a double benefit. They receive the farming payments based on past activity that was in good land, but now they attach those entitlements to cheaper land to rent, so they're clearly making a profit, and they meet the minimum activity levels for that rough grazing land and wherever that may be in Scotland. And the second benefit, of course, is still own the good land of which the payments originally were attached to, and they can rent that out for a good rent because it's good quality land and continue to get income as well. So that's a sort of rough guide to the problem we've had under the existing Common Agricultural Policy. And clearly, that is an appalling state of affairs when we have new entrants who are genuinely active and not receiving any payment. So when we have payment going to inactive farmers and we're denying payment to active farmers, that's clearly untenable. So that's why we fought hard for the Scottish Clause to give us the ability in Scotland to define activity better, put those regulations in place, and then freeze out what we'd regard as inactive farmers so they don't receive payments. And also the fact that we're going to have more than one payment region in Scotland under the new cap means the transferring between regions will not be allowed. So that'll be an extra barrier. So there'll be the barrier of putting new activity levels in, which I'll refer to in a second, and then the other barrier of not being able to transfer from good land to poor land, the payments, because if Scotland's divided into different regions, you're not allowed to transfer between regions. So that would prevent what's been happening in the past, hopefully. However, we do recognise that with all walks of life, there'll be people out there trying to work their way around the regulations and maintain payments for doing as little activity as possible. So that's why it's really important we have to put in some robust definitions of activity. And what we've been negotiating with the European Commission in terms of implementing the Scottish Clause, the detail of it, is using some clauses in the regulations to do two things, which the Commissioner told us we are able to do when we met him a few weeks ago. One is establishing some livestock units in terms of activity on the land. And we have to give an alternative if a farmer's not stocking with livestock, other ways in which they can keep the land in good condition. And then we have the ability to set the bar so high that it would be unlikely any farmer would go for that particular option in terms of keeping the land in good conditions if it was grazed, if they were not to keep livestock. So having those activity criteria put in place and making the threshold quite difficult to achieve if they choose not to have livestock, we believe will help freeze out inactivity and slipper farming. So that's our proposed way forward. We're still working in actual detail, and people clearly have different views on where the threshold should be for activity, but in terms of freezing out inactivity, we're now confident we've got a way forward.
Like Ferguson, yes.
Can I just continue that? Just a little bit. And Cabinet Secretary, good morning, by the way. There may not be a lot you can say about this, and I understand that, given the stage we're at. But presumably there comes a time where, in negotiating a degree of activity that needs to be in place before you can attract the subsidy, there is a danger that conflates with productivity. And presumably the difficulty at European level is how you balance those two. Are you reasonably satisfied with the way discussions are going, that the level of activity you'll be able to reach will be robust enough to ensure that level of activity constitutes genuine farming, as opposed to just a way around the rules?
Well, Alec Ferguson raised a very good point, because at the heart of this issue is the inability to attach or link directly payments to activity. That's why this is a debate in the first place, is because we can't simply say you have to keep X number of stock on your land to receive payment, because that would be headage payments, and of course that's not permitted. That's why we're moving from headage payments to area payments, or historic payments to area payments in the first place, is to break that link. It goes by area of land you have as opposed to livestock you keep. So therefore, what we're doing here, in terms of how you keep the land in good agricultural condition and show you're active in doing that, is that to keep land in good condition, you can use grazing as a way in which you achieve that. And of course, grazing means you have to have livestock, and therefore, you're right, we have to be careful that we don't step over the mark and have too clear a link between livestock kept to achieve the grazing, to keep the land in good agricultural condition, and the level of payments received. So it's a criteria more than a set figure. But we do have to have some kind of formula to use, because keeping one sheep on 10,000 hectares, I think most people say is not activity. But we're not having a straightforward formula per se, which would be headage payments. So we're having to come up with a formula that's reasonable, that across the area of land you'd have to have a certain amount of activity, of grazing activity and livestock units to achieve that, to keep the land in good condition to qualify for farming payments.
It's like be measured by the condition of the land rather than the amount of livestock on that land, is it?
Yes, but you have to have livestock, because
of course, yeah.
To define activity on hill land in Scotland, several thousand hectares, the only really way you can be active as a farmer on that to keep the land in good graze conditions to have livestock. So clearly livestock is part of the solution. But it's how we interpret these regulations will be very important, because if it's deemed to be headage payments, clearly it would not be permitted. And the point I have to clarify is, for this to be possible, we have to give the farmers an alternative. So they've got to keep the land in a condition, and our advice from the Commissioner was clearly we have to be careful in terms of how we're using the livestock as a criteria to meet the right conditions to be deemed active. And the way around that is to give the farmers an alternative which does not involve livestock. And we therefore have put to the Commissioner, who's said it's perfectly feasible to do this, that we have something that's easy to achieve, which is to have livestock to deem yourself active, but they've got to have an alternative which does not involve livestock, but that's difficult to achieve. And that's why, therefore, in reality, we're trying to put a system in place that, to be deemed active, you have to have livestock in your land, because the alternative will be so difficult to achieve that you just won't do it, and therefore you'd be deemed an inactive farmer. But for WTO rules, we have to give an alternative that does not involve livestock.
Good luck with
So
that.
it's very complex. It's very complex, as you can understand, the sort of issues we have to deal with in terms of the Common Agricultural Policy. But I hope that makes sense in terms of the approach that we've found a way through this. Because the alternative, of course, is just to reward inactivity. So we have to define activity somehow.
Stage payments were so simple, weren't they? With reference here for determining the eligible area for basic payments, it's likely to be 2015. What's your view about the arguments that suggest that people are, at the present time, giving larger rents for grasslets and so on, so that they can hold on to an extra amount of land in total, so that they can qualify in 2015? And looking at Roger McCall's argument from the New Entrants Group, why not agree with some means to interfere with that? And Johnny Hall's suggestion from the NFU that in fact 2013 would be a better time to look at the payments per applicant for active farming.
This is a good question in terms of how we allocate entitlements in 2015 and who receives them. And of course, here we are in 2014, and many people in the farming sector are looking forward to 2015, trying to work out what's to their best advantage to qualify for maximum payments. And people, quite understandably, will take advice from agents and others about how to maximise their payments in 2015, and that will influence their rent agreements, that will influence their decisions to let land or not this year, because they'll be trying to preempt any decisions that are taken in terms of implementing CAP in 2015. So this is an issue we're thinking about very seriously. But as you can imagine, there's pros and cons of picking 2015 as the date of who's in control of the land as opposed to 2013 and vice versa, because there's so many different circumstances out there. So you may have had a farmer who expands his business between 2013 and 2015. So he's a genuine farmer who's expanded his business. So if we were to choose 2013 as effectively the qualification date, then they would complain that they're an active, genuine farmer, but they're not going to get entitlements on the additional land, potentially, that they took on board between then, so they would be disadvantaged. And you probably would argue they should not be disadvantaged. But then likewise, you could have an opposite situation where, as you suggested, there are some circumstances where maybe tenant farmers or people who are having annual seasonal lets are being disadvantaged because there's an incentive to take land back in hand to make sure by 2015 that land is in the hands of those who originally used to let it out because they want to qualify for maximum payment themselves in 2015. So that disadvantaged those who wanted to let the land from them. So there's a myriad of circumstances out there, and we're trying to balance up the pros and cons of the 2013 versus the 2015 date. Drew, in particular, has been looking at this in detail because our minds are going back and forth on this all the time because of the pros and cons of each date for different circumstances. Do you want to say a bit more about the choices we face in terms of 2013 and 2014?
Yeah, the regulation makes most of this clear. The entitlements will be allocated to the land that's controlled in 2015. but there is a clause where you can limit the number of entitlements to the land declared in 2013. So one of the challenges to the convener's question is it's not linked to the exact piece of land that that tenant is renting. It is just purely 2015 with a cap on the number of entitlements any individual can get if you choose to invoke the 2013 land declared rule. And as the Cabinet Secretary has mentioned, while we have had many stakeholder views that if they're seeing it from one angle, they can see why you're not going out and doing that now. And it's when you look at the whole situation, because it's not about that individual piece of land, you start to get a lot of consequences and ways round the rules, and therefore you may not stop the behaviour that you think the obvious decision would stop. There are ways round this. And there's a whole lot of added complexity that becomes if you invoke that rule rather than a clean start in 2015. So I think it's still very much in the balance. Obviously the consultation's out there, and I'll just ask everyone that's thinking about this, it's the unintended consequences, and start thinking about every situation on this. And it's really linked to, it's not linked to a particular piece of land. You can't sort of pinpoint it as in 2013 who had control of that piece of land. And as I say, I think that really opens the question up as to what is the right solution.
So we'd be grateful for the committee's views on this very complex issue. So look forward to your reports with anticipation that you've got the answer.
Clearly, from the point of view of the new entrants group, they're interested in being able to have farms to move on to, and I very much welcome the Forestry Commission setting up a new entrance unit near Halkirk and Caithness in my constituency. But we would need dozens of these if we were to meet the demand that there is around the country, because it's the one part where we can intervene directly as the government to try and create help in that direction. But in the meantime, the young farmers that we're talking about who are getting into farming are due a top-up. How is the government planning to implement the young farmer top-up? And how many of these young farmers do you think will be getting a top-up?
Thank you. So, to take a step back for a second or two, there are many farmers understandably concerned by the reduction in payments they expect to receive under the new Common Agricultural Policy, and there are several reasons for that. Firstly, there's the overall budget situation, and if you have a smaller budget, clearly there are going to be smaller payments. There's the fact that new entrants are coming on board to the new policy, therefore they have to get a fair share of payments, therefore there's less left in the pot for existing farmers. So that's another reason why payments may go down. And then the final reason is there's some mandatory deductions as part of the new policy. And the young farmer provision that you refer to, convener, is one such mandatory deduction, so we have to do that. So again, that's another reason why other farmers' payments will go down slightly, because the budget's got to cater for that mandatory deduction. There's a few options within the policy of how to implement that young farmer top-up. And the one I'm sure I'm right in saying that we've proposed within the consultation and have been thinking about is topping up by 25% of the average payment within that region. So that would be the one that we favour at the moment, which would give the top-up to young farmers. David, you've been involved in choosing when we were discussing the four options, but that's, I don't want to say a wee bit more about why we chose the 25%, because there's a big debate around that.
Yes, I think perhaps the simplest thing is to refer the committee to the direct payments consultation paper, and the question 49 is the question about this young farmer top-up, and the four options are there summarised in the text that comes immediately before question 49. Essentially, I think probably it's fair to say this is one of those areas where Europe has probably put an unnecessarily complicated set of options in place because some member states wanted very specific things. All of the first three options essentially place a limit on the number of hectares on which the top-up would be paid. The approach suggested in the consultation paper is that if paying this top-up is a good thing, then it should be proportionate to the size of the business, and therefore option 4 is the one where the size of the top-up is bigger or smaller depending on the overall size of the business. So that's the option that's recommended on the basis of which question 49 of the consultation document seeks the views of stakeholders. But as with everything, it's a decision that will be not finalised until post-consultation.
Okay, thank you for that. Move on to payment regions now. Jim Hume.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning. And of course, I remind everybody of my register of interest. There was quite a concern regarding rough grazing. I think NFU stated that if the €25 per hectare stayed as was in the consultation, that may decimate quite a large proportion of areas. Crofton Federation also were very concerned, and we're talking about could lead to land abandonment, which seems quite dramatic, obviously, and concerning. Just wonder what the Cabinet Secretary's view at the moment is regarding the sort of rough grazing payment system, whether it should be 2 regions or just the 1 region regarding RGR.
Again, this is one of the big issues being debated just now in Scottish farming, is given we're moving from historic to area payments and we have the option of paying different levels of area payments in different parts of the country, you know, how many different rates should we have and how much should the rates be? So clearly that's a very fundamental point, what people's payments are going to be. So it's causing a lot of debate, because the mere fact we're moving from historic to area payments is going to shift support payments around the country and around sectors. So that's why it's such a fundamental issue. So clearly, as we take forward the debate over how to implement the policy, we have to decide a couple of things. Firstly, to what extent should we be supporting production? And production, of course, is higher on good land. So is the aim of the policy to support productive agriculture? Or should we give more emphasis or equal emphasis to saying, well, if it's good land, there's less need for support, therefore there's more need for support on poorer areas of land if we want to maintain agriculture activity in these areas of Scotland and get all the environmental benefits and other public goods. So clearly, the emphasis you place on both these aims influences what the payment rates would be. Because if you feel the emphasis should be on supporting productivity, clearly you would want to support activity where the production is taking place and make sure that continues and supported, so the emphasis of the payments would go to that area. If you felt that you have to put more money into those areas of Scotland where the land's poor and the challenges are greater, then clearly that would be influencing the payment rates. So we've had to take these things into account, and that's the balance we've tried to achieve in what's proposed in the consultation, where there would be a shift from, under moving from historic to area basis, there would be a shift from the better land to the poorer land in Scotland. Partly because clearly those areas of Scotland with the better land attracted the highest headage payments in the past, therefore had the highest historic payments, and therefore are going to take more of a reduction as you move from historic to area payments. And partly because we understand we do have to support those areas of Scotland where there's poorer land. So while it's not a huge shift of funds from the productive land to the less productive land under the move to area payments, there is a shift. And in terms of crofting counties, most of the crofting counties would gain. However, clearly the argument from the crofters is that the €25 per hectare, or the rates proposed, don't go far enough, because the bulk of the support will still go to those areas with the better land, and that's a legitimate debate to have. Likewise, the other side of the debate would say that if an estate has 20,000 hectares and is not particularly active, why on earth would we want to put more payment towards that if the idea is to support activity and production? So this is a dilemma we face in terms of choosing the rate. and the number of regions. If we chose a rate that favoured crofters in terms of the argument you just put, they want a higher rate for the poorer land, that would also benefit the massive landowners who've got tens of thousands of hectares and are not very active. So we could take that decision in theory, up the rate for rough grazing, which would maybe help some crofters, but it would help the massive landowners as well. So, as you can imagine, the fallback would get, the fallout we'd get from that would be pretty substantial. So these are the issues we're taking into account as part of the consultation. We've invited people's views on the number of regions and the payment rates. So the final point, of course, is the number of regions. And because if you split Scotland into 2 regions, clearly there's going to be people who work in farms that have a bit of rough grazing and a bit of better quality land, and they would be penalised by a very low rate because actually they're quite active, and therefore there's an argument that perhaps we should look at the better rough grazing where livestock is kept and separate that from the really poor rough grazing where there's less activity and less livestock. So that's the argument clear of having 2 essential rough grazing regions. The challenges we face is where you draw the line. This has got to be inspected. The farmers themselves have to decide what they want to put forward as the third, the better rough grazing versus the poor rough grazing. They would have to decide. And then, of course, if they're caught out by the inspectors, there's all that to contend with. So the onus on the farmers would be a lot more complex the more regions you have, as well as the onus on the compliance authorities from the government's perspective. So we have to take these things into account. However, the pros may outweigh the cons. If we're directing more support to genuine activity on many livestock farms that do use what we'd classify as rough grazing, but it's good, actually a bit better quality than the mountains, then that could be a good argument. So these are sort of factors we're taking into account.
I appreciate that, and I'm aware you're aware of all the complexities of the whole thing. It was brought up, obviously, that our sheep and cattle, which make their good Scottish lamb and good Scottish beef, is mainly produced, of course, in what is called rough grazing, and there was concerns that areas where there's very little activity would be overcompensated and other areas would be undercompensated, where areas where you don't have options to plant grain, etc. It was interesting, you mentioned about the crofting there, but Scottish Crofting Federation, Patrick Krause, he stated, and I quote, it doesn't make sense that 90% of the budget's being spent on supporting farmers with better quality land and 10% on the poorer quality land. I just wondered if you like to comment on that, if possible.
Well, as I said in my original comments, these are the policy aims we have to work out where we want the emphasis to lie in terms of actual implementation of the policy. Because every regulation you implement has got an outcome. So we're trying to look at the outcomes we're going to achieve from implementing the policy in different ways. And one choice we have is the rates we pay for each payment region and how many payment regions we have. So you have to look at the outcomes. And we've already discussed the need to link, as far as we can within the rules, support to genuinely active farming. And that's a clear issue we face. So if much of the activity in Scottish agriculture is happening in one quality of land, if you wanted to link to activity, clearly that's going to attract a lot of support, financial support. So, but of course, the payment regions are not the only tool in the box. We've got the coupled support. We've got the definition of activity in the first place. So we're trying to look at this in whole. So from the crofters, the crofting communities receive LFAS payments, which we've protected. Crofters keeping cattle will benefit from the beef calf scheme. And then over and above that, you've got the debate over the payment regions. So we have to look at this in the round.
Thanks. I think that leads on to the next question on coupling from somebody else here. Payment.
Thank you very much, Convener and Cabinet Secretary. As you rightly suggested, one of the tools in the box to maybe help to address some of these difficulties is coupled payments. And if I could come on, you've already said that 8% will be an 8% coupled scheme to continue the beef calf scheme. I might come back to that in a minute if I may. But in terms of the rough grazing and in particular the sheep sector, there is now the possibility of an extra 5% coupled payments that could be directed towards the sheep sector to help, which might help to solve some of the difficulties that we've already spoken about. Can you expand on that and what your thinking is on the use of that extra 5%? And are you able to say with clarity that we will definitely be able to employ an extra 5% for coupled payments?
Thank you. So when the PAC report was published, of course, given the importance of the livestock sector to Scotland and the need to support genuine agricultural activity, Brian Pack proposed that we should seek up to 15% of our overall budget being used for couple support schemes for beef and potentially for sheep. And generally in Scotland, we all agreed, government stakeholders, I believe, the political parties, hopefully most of them, that we should consider the continuation of couple support schemes and seek further couple support because it's a means of supporting livestock production as well as linking to activity to some degree. And that was therefore what we tried to negotiate with the UK government and within Europe. And you will be very familiar with the well-rehearsed arguments over this issue, whereby the UK government were not keen on any couple support, and their original position was 0% couple support. So we had this position where we didn't want less couple support, we wanted more in Scotland, but the UK government's policy position was 0%. And then the UK government position changed to 5%, because it was very clear, looking at other member states within Europe, they were going to be outvoted. So therefore they tried to limit couple support to 5%. And then the final deal, of course, gave us 8%. In the consultation, I have said that if we have 8%, as the regulations allow, we would anticipate using that all for the beef sector. However, because of the overall impact of the budget changes and the moving from historic to area basis in the beef sector, we're looking for other ways to help the beef sector, or indeed linking to genuine activity in Scotland, which would also support the sheep sector. So we wanted the ability to get as close to the original 15% we wanted in Scotland, and we've asked the UK government to allow us to use more of the UK flexibility as we did in this CAP policy, because they refused to negotiate it for Scotland. Because they refused to negotiate more than 8% for Scotland, we feel that they should allow us to have more than 8% by using the UK flexibility. And therefore we have asked to use 13%, which is the maximum any other European country will have. Clearly it would be great to have the 15%, but I took the view that it's been difficult enough to persuade the UK to go above 0%, that we should at least match the best that any other European country has, which is 13%. So I've asked for 13%. The UK government have given out many mixed messages on this. There is a lack of clarity. We had the message that there was no appetite for supporting more coupled payments in Scotland than the rest of the UK. Then, when the UK government took the decision not to pass on the conversion uplift to Scotland, they gave an indication at that point that they were willing to go further than 8%, perhaps up to 10%. Since then, they have given further signals that they are not ruling out going up to 13%. But they have made it clear to the Scottish Government that if they go above the 8%, there will be various strings attached. We've tried to iron out those strings with the UK Government. So Owen Patterson said, for instance, he does not want to see any increase in coupled payments increasing production in Scotland. So I'm trying to work out what that means. He has also said that we would have to take responsibility for any disallowance and other issues around the misuse. That's my words, not his, because we don't understand quite what he means. But I assume he means, you know, anything that goes wrong with using coupled payments that results in any penalties or disallowance, we'd have to carry the liability for that. I'd have expected that to be the situation anyway, but apparently this is a string which we're just trying to understand better as well. And finally, that we'd have to go to Europe and ask Europe for permission, which of course I said to UK government, this is a UK internal decision, it's not a European decision. But they've maintained, no, it's a European decision, you have to go to Europe. But as you then will be aware, with George Eustace, the Agricultural Minister from DEFRA, I spoke to the Commissioner at one of the councils a few weeks ago, and the Commissioner gave us a verbal green light and reiterated what I thought was the case, which was it's an internal UK matter. And he is content for Scotland to use 13% couple support if that's what internally the UK is happy to do. And all he's interested in is that the UK as a member state does not breach 8%, which was slightly contrary to the belief of the UK government that we had to get specific permission from Europe. However, we went through that rigmarole and we've got the verbal commitment. Now the UK government have still not given us a commitment to use the 13%. They now want written confirmation from the Commissioner to reiterate what he said verbally to us at a meeting. I'm slightly concerned by this because I think the Commissioner will begin to lose patience with the UK. I think our goodwill is in danger. However, you know, we are still demanding the UK government just to take the decision that they support 13%. If they want to get written confirmation to Commission, whenever, that's up to UK government. But it's an internal decision, and they should just say to us at least they're willing for us to have the 13% if they get the written permission from the Commission. But we've not got even that yet. So in other words, two separate decisions here. The UK can at least say to us, well, if we get the go-ahead from Europe, we're willing to go with 13%, and that would at least let us know we're going to get 13%. But they're not even going that far yet. So it's very frustrating, and I am concerned that keep going back, asking the Commissioner to reiterate what he's already said, which is, you know, cause him to lose patience with the UK. But we are where we are, and at one point in time soon I'll have to take a decision.
Thank you. If you get the extra 5%, what are you going to do with it?
Yes,
if I can come down to it as simply as that.
So I took a long time answering your latter question, which are we going to get it, which is quite a fundamental question, but the other fundamental question is what would you do with it? So of course, as I said at the beginning, we've said that it was 8%, we'd use it for beef, but clearly if it's more than 8%, you know, we're having the consultation and we're having discussions with the industry to try and gauge views. The National Sheep Association and the NFU wrote to me calling for a sheep scheme if we get 13%. Now, there are various factors that have to be taken into account to which livestock sector we support with coupled payments. Coupled payment schemes require a lot more bureaucracy on behalf of government and the producer. For instance, if we have a sheep scheme, it requires more inspections than what a beef scheme does. So, and I'll ask Drew to come in here in a second or two, because Drew heads up the compliance arrangements. So we carry out 3% inspections under the beef scheme, and we anticipate that would have to rise to 10% of farms being inspected if we had a sheep scheme. That entails, as you all know, issues around compliance and penalties and bureaucracy and red tape. And we also have to ask ourselves, what's the purpose of the couple scheme? With beef, you can construct a good argument for a couple scheme because of the costs and the time taken to rear beef and all the various costs involved. Sheep, likewise, is a vitally important livestock sector to Scotland, and of course, if we want to keep sheep in the hills in certain parts of Scotland, there is an argument for a couple scheme there as well, but there's just different arguments sometimes, and different factors that have to be taken into account, notwithstanding the extra bureaucracy and potential penalties and infringements and inspections that have to be carried out. So up until the 13% was an option, the sheep sector, as far as I understood it, did not want any couple scheme. And I know there's still various views within the sheep industry, even with 13%. So we've still got to iron out that debate with the sector to see what's the best option for Scotland.
I'd just go on to just ask you.
Do you want Drew to add anything about
if he does, yeah.
The implications of having a sheep scheme as well as a beef scheme?
Please do.
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. Yes, I think, as the Cabinet Secretary says, that the outcome for the industry and what we're trying to achieve has to be the ultimate goal. I think what I'd like to point out is that those decisions are taken with the knowledge of what it really means in the consequence of inspections, and this committee is well aware of what farmers think of some of the inspections we have to do. For sheep, there are a variety of issues that we may or may not be aware of. The first one is, yes, we currently inspect by regulation about 3% of sheep holdings. That would go up under a coupled scheme, most likely to 10% of claimants with a minimum of about 5 or 6% of the sheep themselves. So you've kind of given a balance. So it's a significant increase in the number of sheep inspections that we would have to do. Different rules apply to the basic cross compliance, which is what we're doing just now, has certain regulations, and it's the 3%. Coupled schemes have separate inspection regulations because the money is directly linked to that. So a significant increase in the number of inspections. I think the committee is also aware we've had audit issues on some of our cross-compliance inspections, one of which is sheep, and we have a disagreement with the Commission at the moment and have been taking legal advice right through to whether we go to the ECJ on our interpretation of the regulation. My concern comes that if we are unsuccessful, and we have another audit mission planned by the EU this spring, if we're unsuccessful in winning our legal case on the regulation regarding sheep inspections, the complexity of sheep inspections as we currently know them will also go up. So I think it's just, I'm making people aware you have to go into this with eyes open, that you've got potentially an increased complex sheep inspection regime coming. And if you decide proactively to double inspections, that may be something that people want to know about before they take the decision. One last point is, the Cabinet Secretary quite rightly mentioned there's a difference between the cattle and the sheep inspections in the regulation. The regulation allows us to reduce from 10% on coupled schemes back down to 5% in the cattle when you have an approved animal database. And the BCMS database is currently deemed to be approved and tracking animals at the individual level. While we have got a sheep EID database, and some people might propose that we could use that to reduce from the 10% sheep back down to 5%, in my mind it's quite some distance away from being approved and used and tracking all individual sheep in the country. It's some distance from that. So there would be choices to make that the industry would have to proactively do something to mitigate should this policy choice become a possibility or be chosen. Thank you.
Can I just add one point to this debate? It's quite important. Yeah. I mean, firstly, I'll come on to my main point in a second. I think it's worth mentioning, but also a secondary point is just that the majority of beef producers have sheep as well. So in terms of how you use the budgets, you know, there are specialist sheep producers, clearly, who would not necessarily have cattle, therefore if there wasn't a sheep scheme, they would not benefit. However, because in terms of the farming enterprise, there's so many mixed farms in Scotland that the resource would still be going to the same farms in most cases, not all cases, but in many cases. But the main point I just wanted to add in was, we spoke earlier on about the payment regions and how many payment regions Scotland should have, and the debate of whether or not to have 2 or 3. And we've said we're open to considering a third, and of course it's a big subject of debate just now. So just to recap, one of the reasons why there's a debate over having a third region is because the low payment rate for the rough grazing region would be deemed as too low and undercompensating livestock producers that use rough grazing in Scotland. And in terms of where we're speaking about, we'll largely be speaking about sheep in terms of the type of land we're speaking about. So the sheep coupled support scheme that many people want and the third region that there's an argument for are linked to the same outcome, supporting the same people generally. And therefore, I think it's important to lay down a marker. It would be extremely difficult for the government to implement both schemes, a third region and a coupled sheep support scheme, because they're targeting the same outcome of supporting effectively sheep producers in certain parts of the country. And from an implementation point of view, the phrase was used earlier on when we were chatting about this, of implementation suicide, to try and implement a third region in Scotland with all the extra bureaucracy and hassle for sheep producers that may entail, and a coupled support scheme for sheep, as well as the third region, which will involve many sheep producers. Both of these things happen at the same time with the implementation of the UCAP, which is already going through, going from historic to area payments and all the changes that entails. It would be extremely, extremely foolhardy to try and implement. So just something to bear in mind as we're taking that debate forward.
Try and get 2 or 3 more questions on Pillar 1 at the moment before we move on to Pillar 2. And I just wanted some clarification, if I can, for what countries actually get 13% couple payments. Which country is it, and what other countries get more than 8% couple payment that we're planning for at the moment?
Right. I'm not sure if I've got a list of countries in front of me. David may recall, I'll come to David in a second. But generally speaking, there's 2 tiers of countries through the negotiation. There was those tiers of countries with a lot of dependency on livestock sectors and the history of using couple support schemes. And then countries such as the UK and perhaps Sweden and a couple of other countries who try and avoid using couple support schemes either for ideological reasons, believe in free market, not subsidies, don't want couple support, which is seen as an extreme form of subsidy, and have not therefore got a history of using them because they ideologically perhaps oppose them. And of course, even though Scotland, as part of the UK, is dependent on the livestock sector and has a history of using the beef calf scheme, the UK took a different view and was content to be in the tier of countries that only is allowed to use 8% because they want to dissuade sectors in the UK from using couple support schemes because they don't believe in them. And therefore we lost out because of that. So it's an example of the distinctiveness between Scottish agriculture and agriculture perhaps in other parts of the UK, and importantly in terms of agricultural policy in Scotland and agricultural policy in the rest of the UK. But because the UK is a negotiating party in Europe, not Scotland, the UK Minister calls the shots. And of course he was looking for 0% couple support, so 8% was probably still 8% more than what he wanted.
Turning to greening now, Graham, first of all.
Cabinet Secretary, the committee's heard appeals that you should not gold plate the planned greening measures. On the other hand, Scottish Environment Link have suggested that because of the resistance to equivalence measures, in reality we're going to end up with little more than greenwash if we're not careful. How in practice will you deliver on your commitment to ensuring that every farmer acts greener as a result of the reforms?
I said all along throughout the whole negotiation that I was in favour of 2 things to do with the greening debate. Firstly, well, 3 things essentially. Firstly, that the CAP across Europe should be greener, because there are many examples of agricultural practice in Europe that should be tackled in terms of their impact on the environment. And secondly, I said that I would like to be in a position where, over the course of the CAP, that Scottish agriculture became greener. And the third point I guess I made was that the definition of greening should take into account the different circumstances in different countries and also the different priorities in different countries. So tackling monoculture in Eastern Europe is perhaps one thing, but the same solution for that should not be imposed in Scotland, where perhaps we've got different challenges. So that's the sort of 3 key messages I was conveying during the CAP negotiations. Thankfully, as the negotiations went on, some of the original proposals for greening, which would have caused real problems in Scottish agriculture, were watered down or changed or adapted, and that's been helpful, but we still have the greening proposal to implement as they stand. So I do want Scottish agriculture to become more green, but I want to make sure what we implement, how we implement it, is practicable and appropriate for Scottish circumstances. So clearly that's now part of the consultation of how we do that. In terms of Pillar 2, We've added more resource in for agri-environment schemes. We've also raised the prospect of carbon audits for every farm in Scotland, because when I talk about greening, I think carbon reduction and climate change friendly farms or climate friendly farms are important. It's not just about the issues of tackling monoculture in Eastern Europe, it's about reducing carbon use, and therefore that saves money for farms as well, makes them more efficient in terms of carbon use and energy use. So there's great benefits to be had by trying to get all our farms in Scotland onto that agenda. So from that perspective, I think we will have a more greener agricultural sector in Scotland over the next few years in terms of tackling carbon emissions and green farming. And also I want to see a much stronger green brand for Scottish produce. So I think that's all wrapped up in that debate, and we will pursue that with the industry. In terms of the 3 specific proposals we have for greening under the cap, though, we are working with our industry on that. And in terms of the stakeholders' input you mentioned of gold plating, well, clearly, if we don't implement the 3 options we have, particularly the 3 crop rule, we have to bring forward equivalence measures so they achieve the same outcome in a different way. Trying to find equivalent measures is quite challenging, that are not bureaucratic and not gold plating and not really difficult to implement. So that's part of the debate we're having just now. We are looking at the potential of an environmental certification scheme, which would be a kind of equivalence. So we'd have to understand what that meant and work with the industry to define a certification scheme which farmers could apply for, as opposed to going down the road specifically of the 3 different measures. So that's all up in the air just now, because we're having that discussion and debate with the industry. Because the last thing we want to do is say, oh, the 3 options we've got from Europe are too difficult, we're not doing that, but then come up with something that's much more difficult to implement and much more bureaucratic and potentially gold-plated. So we have to be careful.
Further Cabinet Secretary, in relation to the fruit and vegetable sector, William Houston of Angus Growers told us that under the intensive fruit and vegetable scheme, there's a requirement for anyone benefiting from it to make year-on-year environmental improvements, and that particular organisation, as suppliers to Sainsbury's, are signed up to their 2020 target, which demands a 20% reduction in emissions by 2020. So in some sectors there's already good work going on. But he raised concerns with us that the combined requirements of the fruit and vegetable scheme and the potential requirements of Pillar 1 greening would make it quite difficult to manage the productive area of a fruit farm. He pointed out that it would be challenging for his sector to meet the cropping requirements. He suggested a better approach would be to be very green, as he put it, in some areas of the farm, whilst farming intensively, but responsibly in others. I'm just wondering, do you recognise that concern as being justified, and is the suggestion that's been put by way of a solution something that might be workable and worth considering?
I'll look closely at the representations you received from the soft fruit sector and the wider vegetable and potato sector as well. I mean, firstly, in terms of reducing pesticide use and looking for better ways of growing our crops and getting better yields in a sustainable way, it's something we should be doing anyway. It's in the economic interests and clearly in the customers' interests, i.e. the retailers, that we do these things anyway in these sectors. So it's a win-win, and I want to support that in any way I can through Pillar 2. But in terms of the actual greening proposals that we have as part of the regulations, well, clearly the potatoes and vegetable crops will be affected, because in terms of the crop diversification through the 3 crop rule, etc., that potentially will impact in these sectors. Hopefully not hugely, but potential for some impact there. In terms of the soft fruit sector, well, that's not really deemed an arable crop under the regulations as such. So I'd be surprised if the soft fruit sector was affected by these regulations. I mean, I'll double check that clearly, but on the face of it, they should not be too concerned. But maybe there's something out there I'm not aware of that he's discovered that would affect them. So obviously we'll look at that in terms of implementation.
I think that would be useful. We would offer some reassurance to that sector who had expressed a concern.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Claudia?
Building on the questions by my colleague Graham Day, could I ask you, just taking a step back, I was heartened in relation to greening agriculture that you said that one of your priorities was that Scottish agriculture should be greened, and I'm very keen to see any comments you have about how this really can be done more broadly in Pillar 1? Because obviously this is money that's coming from Europe to support farmers, and it's an opportunity to move forward, not just within the three greening criteria, or hopefully the equivalence and the possibly environment certification scheme, but I'm wondering whether something like the carbon assessment, which in our evidence some were indeed shying away from due to weather issues and others, that whether this might be possible to actually make this at least voluntary this time around, or if not mandatory, to drive forward the essence of good practice, which will save money for farmers, but also help with our climate change and the criteria that the EU set for climate action and sustainable farm management.
Well, I'm attracted to every farm in Scotland, for instance, undertaking a carbon audit over the course of the next CAP. And the sooner the better, clearly, but, you know, there's a lot of farms out there, so I can't necessarily predict a timescale, but the idea that every farm in Scotland goes through a carbon audit, I think, is a good one. And as I said before, it's a win-win situation. I'd be very surprised and disappointed if any farmer in Scotland is reluctant to go through a carbon audit. As you know, we have some monitor farms set up for climate change purposes, and they're coming out with some really good statistics about cutting carbon and costs, and they're signed up now to the whole idea of becoming a climate-friendly farm. So there's really hard economic benefits to be had there, as well as for the environment. And in terms of Pillar 1, which was your question as well, about how we can use Pillar 1 to green farming in Scotland. Well, clearly, in terms of the greening proposals, we have to take some decisions. So if we had a certification scheme and we wanted to tackle climate change through the certification scheme, we would have to look at the use of nutrients on our grassland, for instance, and how we go about that. There's some specific decisions we'd have to take. So, for instance, we'd have to decide whether to prohibit ploughing on environmentally sensitive grasslands or outside the Natura sites. We'd also have to decide what kind of areas would qualify as the ecologically focused areas, which is one of the three greening measures in Pillar 1 as well. And also in terms of keeping land in good agricultural condition, there's the option of using those particular regulations for greening measures as well we'd have to think about. So field margins or whatever that may be. So there's a number of options there. Some of them won't go nearly as far as some of the NGOs want. And of course others may entail additional complexity or bureaucracy, which we want to be careful about as well in terms of the farmers and businesses would not want to have more of that. So we just have to strike a balance. But there's a number of options we are looking at.
I hope it's encouraging that some of the Rural Affairs Committee went to see the Green Cow initiative, and we also saw the possibilities of carbon assessment being done online that didn't take an enormous amount of a farmer's time on an annual basis, and so that was quite encouraging. It might be somewhere to start.
I've made the point several times before that we can't have the industry agreeing with government, and indeed sometimes, making it a key point for the future of food production in Scotland, that we want to sell ourselves to the rest of the world as sustainable green food productions and food producers without it being green and sustainable. So we have to, we have to put our money where our mouth is, and we have to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. And I hope we can work in partnership with our agricultural sector in the coming years to make sure that happens.
Possibly the final point, Pillar 1 at the moment, I think, on capping of payments to individual farmers. Cara Hilton.
Hi, just on the issue of capping of payments to individual farmers, an issue that has been raised is that it could be quite difficult to enforce, and that you could see some farm businesses splitting to avoid the cap. I mean, I appreciate this is part of the consultation that is still ongoing, but how are you minded to cap payments and to ensure that they are properly enforced?
Well, my situation, forgive the cliches, remains that I've not ruled out capping. So I have some sympathy for capping payments, but I also have some concerns, and you've outlined some of the reasons for those concerns. And again, I find it really helpful to have the committee's views on the issue of capping. I think a good point to make, though, is that both the cap regulations will impact on the size of payments in two ways. Firstly, degressivity, which means that actually built into the regulations is we have to reduce payments to certain farmers over a certain level. So you could call that capping if you wanted, but it's a reduction of payments over a certain level. So when we had the original debate in capping in Scotland, of course, that was before these regulations were passed by Europe. Now we have that in the regulations, they have to happen. So it's not a cap per se, but it's a degressivity in that payments will be reduced if you receive more than a certain amount. So that's there. So that is inevitably one way in which payments are going to be kept lower. And secondly, the mere fact we're moving from historic to area payments will cut some of the big payments that have been hitting the headlines in recent years. So farming enterprises have built up big track records on headage payments, and therefore they've bought more entitlements on top of that, therefore they get big single farm payments. These command the headlines. Well, they'll be cut down significantly by moving to area payments. So if I were to show you the top 10 single farm payment or basic payment, whatever you want to call it under the new system, the top 10 recipients in Scotland in 2015 compared to what was in the headlines of the farming press in 2013, there'll be different people and there'll be much smaller payments. Now, I can't actually show you that because we've not taken the decisions yet, but I'm pretty certain that that's what we're going to find, is that, you know, so people, and I think these concerns are very understandable and I share them, so anyone who's been concerned about high farming payments not being quite justified in this day and age will actually find that there are some changes in the pipeline that will tackle some of these concerns. So that's the background, but it does not remove the need to take a decision on capping. So, you know, if someone get £10 million before, and they're only getting £2 million now, or under 2015, for instance, I'm just grabbing these figures out of thin air, that doesn't still remove the debate for cap, because maybe they should only get £1 million, or maybe we want to take a decision as a country that no one should get over X, Y, or Z. So the capping debate is still there, and a decision still has to be taken. But I just want to put into context of how people, I think, will be pleasantly surprised by those that were receiving big payments in the past who commanded the headlines, and where these people will be in the future. The final comment I want to make is that there will still be a top 10 recipients or top 20 recipients. And as I said before, there will be different people. And the more we move to area basis, the more the people that will benefit are those with the most land, because it's area based. So the need for a capping debate is still there.
Then Claudia Beamish.
So, I recognise this may be a difficult question to ask our Cabinet Secretary, but in stakeholder evidence sessions it was suggested to us that if there was a cap of €150,000 introduced based on the old system, that might affect around 60 businesses all told, and a separate claim that that sort of cap might save €20 million, which could go to Pillar 2 potentially, give that a small boost. Are those figures you would recognise?
That's why I thought it was quite important to make the points I've just made, because I expect a lot of people, I'm not speaking for the committee, I'm sure you've been lots of foresight to be looking at these things, but generally speaking, the debate in Scotland about capping and about size of payments, I wanted to put onto the record that actually the system's going to change, as I've just explained, for a couple of reasons. So the figures you've just mentioned relate to the current cap, and I can't say they're exactly right, but yes, I do identify with the thrust of what you're saying. But that will change, so you can't compare. You're comparing apples and pears, basically.
But at the risk of labouring the point, do you have a ballpark figure about the number of businesses that might be affected by this?
No, I don't. And when you have the capping debate, you have to think about outcomes. So clearly, a farmer who's keeping 1,000 head of cattle would get a bigger payment if you were linking to activity or food production, or however you want to describe it, compared to a farmer who's got 10 head of cattle. So it's got to be outcome based as well. And, you know, if you take a decision as a country that you're going to support food production, clearly the bigger farmer who's most productive is going to get a bigger payment. So you've got to be outcome focused and think, well, that's justified. You know, like, that's perfectly justified because we're getting the return as a country from supporting that enterprise. So you've got to be outcome focused, not just set on specific figures necessarily. So what I intend to do with this whole debate is clearly look at the big picture and work out to what extent the recipients are productive and can be justified in the public interest. And then we have to take a decision on that basis.
Claudia?
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Could I ask your Cabinet Secretary how the possibility of the, if I can say it, the redistributive payments, which are highlighted in the consultation, how that fits or doesn't fit with the possibility of the capping issue? Because it's been highlighted to me by some farmers locally in South Scotland that that their understanding is that Scotland can use up to 30% of the direct payment ceiling to top up basic payments for the first 30 or the first 54 hectares. And it's also been highlighted that in the view of some, this mechanism redistributes funding from larger beneficiaries to smaller beneficiaries. And there hasn't been very much discussion about this, or not evidence I've seen unless I've missed it. But I'm just wondering if there's anything you could say about that.
Yeah. Well, firstly, if you use the redistributive payment, which I think it was the French that mooted for that in the regulations, you don't have to use the degressivity clause. So degressivity, the reduction of payments, only applies where you're not using the redistributive payment, which of course, as you say, gives a higher payment to the first X number of hectares you have. We have done some analysis on the impact on Scottish farming of using that. I'm just trying, it's quite detailed, so I don't want to go through it all in detail with the committee right now. But as you can imagine, some areas where there are smaller farms and smaller enterprises will benefit because the weight of the payment goes to the first number of hectares. But clearly, you have to look at the impact across the whole of the country. So all I can really say is we've asked for views as part of the consultation. Like most of the measures, there's winners and losers in everything you do, and there's different outcomes and unintended consequences. So we've certainly not ruled out using it, and there would be some advantages for smaller producers. But in other parts of Scotland, it would be pretty irrelevant. And therefore, you know, there would be unintended consequences for some parts of Scotland. Because you have to either use it or not use it. You can't use it for just certain farms within certain regions of Scotland. You have to use it or not use it. So we have to be careful that we understand the impact it will have. I don't know if there's anything else. I mean, we've got some. There's a lot of detail, as you can imagine, with various modelling. I don't want to spend hours going through all the detail of the modelling, but I think David's got some figures here you might want to just refer to, David. Just.
Yes, as the Cabinet Secretary says, we've done some modelling. There are papers on this that we've shared with our stakeholder group, which are on the Scottish Government website. I guess the best way to summarise it is that the outcomes you get from modelling are what common sense would lead you to expect. Yes, it does move money modestly, but it does move money from larger holdings to smaller holdings, and therefore that has consequences for the different regions of Scotland, depending on their pattern of holding size. It also means that for those stakeholders who believe a desired outcome is to concentrate money on smaller farms, they would say that's a good thing. There are other stakeholders with whom we've discussed whether, stakeholders perhaps whose interest is in a particular sector, and they have wondered whether this mechanism would happily, coincidentally, give a particular outcome for a particular sector. Generally speaking, the modelling has suggested no, that's not the case. It tends to affect all big farms versus small farms evenly, regardless of whether they are livestock, beef and sheep, arable farms. In other words, it doesn't appear, for those stakeholders who have an interest in helping a particular sector, it doesn't seem to be a tool that would achieve that.
A final question to go back a point to coupled farming on the Pillar 1 side, Alec Ferguson.
You know, I just wonder whether the Cabinet Secretary can comment on this issue, because it's a very big one in my part of Scotland, and it's the issue on the beef calf payment. One of the questions that is being consulted on is whether payments should continue to be restricted to three-quarter bred beef calves, or diluted, if I could put it that way, to half-bred beef calves. And it is a huge issue in my part of Scotland, and I just wondered whether you're able to comment on your thinking on that at this stage, or whether it's too early. If it is, I accept that.
My mind's just calculating who's in your constituency. So am I going to disappoint you or make you happy?
A lot of dairy farmers, Cabinet Secretary.
Well, that's what I was just working out, yeah. So clearly, I've not made any secret of the fact that, I'd be very reluctant to dilute the beef scheme and to depart from three-quarter beef bred, animals. So I'm listening carefully, because there's been quite a vigorous debate, as you know, in the livestock sector, about whether the dairy sector should benefit. I've made no secret of the fact that we've built up the Scotch brands. We have to do what we can to protect that, and we have to be very, very careful about, diluting the beef calf scheme, because people would argue, of course, the beef calf scheme helps support the Scotch brands, and therefore, we must not dilute that at all or weaken it. So, in the consultation, of course, I gave a nod towards keeping the status quo in terms of which, three-quarter beef bred animals benefiting. But, there's a variety of views out there, so...
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think we'll just press on just now, if everybody's happy, on to Pillar 2. We've got a question, first of all, on the overall approach from Angus MacDonald.
Yes, thanks, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, the committee heard in the course of our evidence-taking sessions that there's a general feeling amongst stakeholders that the SRDP should be about delivering transformational change. And given that CAP support's declining overall, SRDP should be about helping farm businesses to adapt so that they can be sustainable with less public support. However, quite a few witnesses were of the opinion that the next SRDP would be more of the same. For example, Professor Bill Slee of the James Hutton Institute told the committee that rather than bringing about the transformational change that has been talked of, it tends to do more of the same. And Andrew Midgley of SLE ventured that there was a lack of vision of where we want to go. What would you say is the transformational change that's required in Scottish agriculture, and how do you see the new proposals in SRDP delivering transformational change?
Well, firstly, I do believe there are elements of the new Rural Development Programme that will in themselves be transformational to a degree, but clearly in terms of the overall Rural Development Programme, it's difficult to say it can be transformational when the budget is so small compared to what other countries have. So we have challenges with a Rural Development Programme. The main one, of course, is the budget. Other countries who have secured major uplifts in their Pillar 2 budgets, their rural development budgets, they can come before their parliamentary committees and talk about they can be really transformational because they've got an additional few hundred million euros to invest. And I don't have that, unfortunately. So I can't make brand new announcements about huge new agendas that we're going to support to transform the rural economy or our agriculture. However, and I'll come back to that in a second, however, there are some measures that I believe within the Rural Development Programme that can, within their specific sectors or areas, help on the path to transformation. And clearly, we've put some emphasis, as you'll know from the consultation, on knowledge transfer and innovation, and also getting enterprises to work more closely together cooperatively. So in terms of helping our rural enterprises and agricultural enterprises become more fit and ready to meet the challenges of the 21st century, to take best use of technology, to be innovative, and as I said before, to work closer together for various purposes. It could be environmental, or it could be marketing, or whatever it could be. I think that will help make our sectors more efficient, more nimble, and adapt better to all the big issues that are out there in the 21st century. So I want our sectors to be more technologically advanced. I want them to be reliant on innovation and work with our scientific institutions to find the right answers to meeting the demands of the marketplace in the 21st century, whatever it may be, or reducing their carbon emissions, and all these big issues are out there. So I think there are some good new ways in which we can help support that in Pillar 2, but clearly we have the ongoing pressures. We've got the legacy schemes to fund, so a lot of the funds will continue some of the schemes already in place, the legacy funds. Clearly we have the forestry budget to maintain, and we have added some more money into agri-environment schemes as well, but the budgets limit what we can do there. So there is a bit of business as usual, I fully accept that, but there are some innovative measures in there as well that can be transformational for certain sectors in Scotland.
Thank you. Okay. No further points on that. Move on to agri-environment, climate activities. Claudia Beamish.
Cabinet Secretary, there was some evidence given to us about this scheme and concerns about how it goes forward. And David McCracken of SRUC told the committee that the suggestion that the budget should be focused in areas where the Scottish Government has a statutory remit, such as the climate change or water directives, and possibly the Natura 2000 obligations. And he questioned whether the 2020 targets in the revised Scottish Biodiversity Strategy could be met with the approach that there is at the moment. Further, the Scottish Environment Link said that looking at the budget on an annual basis for the agri-environment schemes, that the 10 million was, I think she used the word, a pittance. Now, I'm quite aware that you work within the budget that you've got, but in terms of the very big demands that are being made on us as a country, if we're going to move forward in what you're describing as the transformational 21st century way forward, is there any way that the budgets could be looked at in terms of meeting our biodiversity, water quality and climate change targets within SRDP?
Yeah. Well, certainly in terms of how we better target agri-environment schemes, yes, it is my intention to ensure that our targeting is aligned with where we have as a country decided, the emphasis has to be for the future in terms of, be it water quality or biodiversity targets. And clearly, we don't have a huge budget, so we have to better target what we do have. And I am keen to align as far as we can. We've got a lot of legacy projects, but we do have an extra £10 million we're injecting into the budget. I think I'm right in looking at my figures here that we've got about £30 million a year legacy projects, but we've budgeted for about £48 million a year. Is that just for agri-environment? I think that's just the agri-environment figures. So, there's new projects that can be funded, and I will make sure we, as far as we can, align that with what we want to achieve in terms of biodiversity strategies and climate change strategies, as your witnesses, when you were taking evidence, suggested. Obviously, we have SNH with us today, and it would be a pity not to allow Jenny at some point to contribute to today's proceedings. I think you specifically were keen for SNH to come to committee. So I'll invite Jenny to come in a second. But I do want to just really labour the point over the budgets. So Croatia have just joined the EU. Scotland's been in the EU for 40 years, and the UK government have negotiated on our behalf throughout those 40 years. We've ended up with the lowest Pillar 2 budget in the whole of Europe, if you look at it on a per hectare basis, and generally speaking on a cash basis, for most of the countries we compare ourselves with. Therefore, we're very constrained in our options here. Croatia, I think, has negotiated 20 times what we get per hectare. 20 times. So this is a country that just joined the EU last year, was not a member of the EU, and they've gone in there and negotiated a budget which amounts to several hundred million more euros per year than we get in our Pillar 2. But per hectare basis, 20 times more. I mean, you could not make this up. And it's very, very frustrating for me to have to go to Europe and sit with these other countries who are winning bigger shares of the budget in Europe. And we have a government who did not make this a priority in any shape or form, despite our pleading with them to get us off the bottom of the league table. And that's just Pillar 2 I'm talking about. We've just already been discussing earlier on the similar debates we're having over Pillar 1 as well. So I'd love to be able to say to the NGOs and the environmental lobby, because it's the right thing to do for Scotland, that we have the ability to really up our investment in agri-environment schemes throughout Scotland. But clearly, I've given you the figures we do have. We'll do our best with them. But compared to other countries, we're just in a different place. And it's a real pity, because Scotland's a rural country. We've got fantastic landscapes. We've got a great natural environment. But we've got the same environmental challenges that other countries have in the 21st century as well. We're making reasonable inroads with some of them, but we could do with a lot more resources to tackle others. So we just have to be as clever as we can with the limited resources we do have.
That point has been made by yourself, Cabinet Secretary. Could I ask you, just as a further point to working within what we've got, how much specific monitoring and assessment of the schemes that come forward and the expectations that will be set on them, whether you've got work done on that already in terms of it going through?
It's a good time to bring yourself in, because SNH clearly are our colleagues who take forward this work on our behalf, so it would be appropriate, given that SNH are here today, if I can maybe ask Jenny to say a wee bit about that.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and good morning. The SNH view is, from an agri-environment perspective, is largely focused around considering whether or not the new SRDP will deliver for a whole range of environmental benefits. Contributing to the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy is one of them, contributing to designated sites, and the other indicator in the National Performance Framework, which is terrestrial breeding birds. These are all very important priorities that we're looking for in terms of SNH's focus. However, we're not simply just focused on agri-environment priorities in the sense of birds, bees, butterflies, and so on. We recognise, A, the budget limitations, and we recognise, two, the human component. And we have, and we do support the government's move to the increased component in knowledge transfer and exchange, leader, cooperation, and particularly advice as well in the agri-environment climate scheme, making a contributing component to that scheme. It is it's difficult at this stage to say more than that. As far as SNH is concerned, there is in fact quite a lot of transforming going on in terms of the redevelopment of the previous SRDP to the new one. The targeting project that has been undertaken is extremely comprehensive, has involved a large number of stakeholders, some of whom I know were witnesses on the committee at the 5th of March, and they will be aware that we will be restricting our measures within agri-environment climate to specific areas in order to ensure that we target considerably better than we did last time round. And we will also be including targeting criteria within the scoring and assessment part of the application. And we have spent a considerable amount of time with Scottish Government in ensuring that the measures, options as they're termed within SRDP, are much more customer focused, are much more about delivering outcomes, and have wording within them that people understand, that staff understand, and that will help us deliver the outcomes. For example, eligibility is now a key factor which will help us deliver the priorities that we're looking for. There was a question regarding monitoring. There has been a natural heritage monitoring project in the last round, and it is clear that the options, the environmental measures that we had in the last round actually are beginning to deliver. We do have information, evidence that's come forth to show that these options that we have under agri-environment are delivering for a whole range of different sorts of species. In some cases, it's less clear, and we have looked very closely at one or two of the measures within the agri-environment scheme which appear to be, there's less substantive evidence that they're delivering, and we know that in some cases, for example, with farmland waders, that there are issues relating to a continuing steep decline, and we know as well that in order to try and stem that decline, it is not a matter of removing the measures, it's more a matter of ensuring that the measures are taken up in the right groups together and underpinned with very good advice, and that the measures are brought forward through collaborative approaches. So in terms of the new scheme, I believe that we are actually transforming the way in which we actually did try to deliver the scheme last time round, and that the opportunity to deliver more priority outcomes is going to be there. We will have more strategic targeting, we will have an assessment and a scoring system which helps us to deliver where we need to deliver, and we will ensure that the options themselves are able to sort of provide that kind of that range of tools that are so necessary for species and for biodiversity and habitat management in Scotland.
I ask you if at all possible to give us a breakdown in the SRDP in a simple tabular form later of projects approved and the numbers which are legacy projects by type and size and distribution in the country. I don't know whether these are figures that are readily available, but it certainly would help us to see how agri-environment and so on is, taking its place in that, because otherwise, we're talking about, a whole lot of species of birds and all the rest of it. Well, we can't take the time just now to identify in which parts of the country these are, to see if agri-environment's attractive to people in different parts of Scotland, which we've got a responsibility for making sure that they get involved, because we know that some other aspects of farming can be less environmentally friendly in some parts of Scotland.
Yes, we'll make sure we get information to you. I was just relieved you used the word later. We were speaking there. But yes, we will make sure we put it together in an easy, digestible form for you, so it'll be handy. We have looked at similar information, but it'll be handy to make it as easily understood as possible.
That would be helpful. Thanks very much. Question about support for forestry from Dick Lyall, please.
Morning, Cabinet Secretary, and firstly can I compliment you on the evidence you've given this morning and also the hard task you have over the next period, and basically concur with your statement that Scotland is getting a bad deal, and hopefully after September we'll change that. But to go on to the point I should be asking you, in regards to forestry, and you have various pressures and various evidence to this committee, we've heard contrasting views on whether the amount budgeted for forestry is sufficient. I understand Stuart Goodall has argued that more funding was needed, as the amount proposed in the consultation was completely insignificant to deliver the government's objectives for forestry. and also at the final programme there was a need for differential between investing in productive forestry and other types of woodland creation. Johnny Hall, and you're getting the contrast, you know, those for and those against. Johnny Hall of NFUS has argued that the planting budget should be reduced from 10,000 hectares per year to 5,000 hectares per year, and that this could save around £16 million to be used for other SRDF measures to help the farm businesses become more efficient. He's also suggested this would reduce the risk of woodland expansion into better quality farmland. Can you, Cabinet Secretary, can you tell me how the support for forestry and SRDP can ensure that the Government's objectives for forestry are met?
Thank you. Well, given the importance of forestry to the Scottish economy, I am determined to do continue to support it through Pillar 2 in the Rural Development Programme. And it's unlikely, I've not seen clearly the full analysis of all the responses we've had to the consultation so far, but it's unlikely that I will be listening to those voices, I'm afraid, who want to transfer resource out of the forestry budget into other budgets, particularly agriculture, given that agriculture and forestry are actually quite closely related, and agriculture can benefit from forestry as much as other budget headings. But the idea that, you know, the Rural Development Programme, which already devotes around 2/3 of its budget to agricultural-related activity, should transfer money out of the forestry budget to make that even greater proportion, I think would be pretty unfair towards all the people who work in forestry in Scotland, and not least their ability to try and achieve our climate change targets, of which forestry plays a key role in helping us achieve. So I need to strike a balance. We have not increased the forestry budget for a number of years, but we have protected it, if that makes sense, in that we've not reduced it. So whilst we'd like to be in a position to increase it for the budget reasons we've already explored, we're unable to do that the way we'd like, but we are protecting it, and so, you know, effectively be a rollover. We have begun to get close to our targets for tree planting. Yes, there were some challenges 2 or 3 years ago, but in the last year or so, we're now approaching our targets, and we feel confident we're in line to achieve them. So the last thing we want to do is roll back the budget for that. There are tens of thousands of people working in forestry as well in Scotland, and it contributes hundreds of millions of pounds to our economy. So we have to protect the economic contribution as well as the contribution to climate change targets and biodiversity and their natural environments.
Can I thank you for that answer? That actually was my next question. Can I take this opportunity? I intend actually to come off this committee after the recess. Can I take this opportunity to compliment you on the way that you conduct yourself, the way that you fight for Scotland, and I know the commitment you have to both the food and drink industry, and I sympathise with you in regards to all the situations you're going to face over the next. You can't please all of the people all the time, even though you will. I'm sure you will try. And can I? Okay, thanks. No, it's just a comment.
Thank you. Indeed, we have a question on forestry. Jim Hume.
Yeah, just on forestry, there has been conflicts in several areas of land use with forestry versus normal sort of usual agricultural activity. Part of the conflict and opportunities, of course, that are perhaps missed is the fact that a large part of Scotland is tenant farmed, and tenant farmers, if they plant trees, one, may not be there in the 40 years it takes to harvest it. Two, they can be charged for dilapidation by landlords, perhaps, if they see land being taken out of normal agricultural use and trees planted. I just wonder, it's been discussed before around this table, but has the Minister considered looking at ways to address that by perhaps forestry being considered as perhaps a tenant's improvement, so therefore if it's been 7 years planted, they could get the value of it as a 7-year-old plant, as is perhaps common with more traditional sort of grass and normal crops. A way of opening up the opportunities for perhaps small amounts of forestry to integrated with normal agricultural use on land.
Yeah, I'm pleased to hear comments about the potential for integrating agriculture with forestry, and there are mutual benefits. And it's heartening to see the farming publications now devoting more column space to this issue. So there's a lot of people out there in agriculture thinking about the benefits of forestry, and that's a good thing, because integrated land use is the way forward, as opposed to conflict between different land uses. In terms of the tenancy arrangements, you have reminded me to ensure that our Agricultural Holdings Review Group are looking at this particular issue. They're looking at the issue in the round and generally about tenancy improvements and what qualifies for that and what doesn't. But I'll certainly ensure that the issue of forestry, which I think you quite rightly highlight, is taken into account, because you can see very clearly, as you outlined, why it's not necessarily in the interest of tenant farmers to embrace forestry if they're not going to see any financial benefit from it in the years ahead. So, yeah, so it's a very fair point, and I'll make sure the Agricultural Holdings Review Group take that into account.
It would be the case that we should probably remind the farming world that since we've had farming and forestry in the same department in the Parliament here since devolution, that perhaps they should realise that they're integrated, not separate. But I'm just making that comment out of frustration about the nature of responses to forestry, which we found shocking. Graham Day?
Yeah, if I may, Cabinet Secretary, take you back. I think you used the phrase that you managed to protect the forestry budget, but you I think indicated you would like to grow in the budget. On that theme, one of the points that Stuart Goodall made was that he felt the 36 million a year was inadequate, not least of all because I think the phrase he used was forestry has become a bucket for anything that's related to forestry, pests, tree disease, etc., etc. Would you accept that we're expecting the budget to do more for forestry than it may have had to do in the past? But alternatively, we had evidence from Patrick Krauser that suggested that perhaps directing money away from forestry towards peatland management might gain us a better return in terms of a carbon reduction effort. So I mean, there's obviously two competing views there, but I just wonder what your thoughts were on both of those.
Well, as we've just been discussing, you also received representations from some sectors wanting us to slash the forestry budget and others saying it's too small, it should be dramatically increased. So we always face those difficulties when we've just got a tight budget situation. I'm just pretty determined to make sure we just achieve a good balance in Pillar 2, and that's why I want to protect the forestry budget, and I will not be subjecting it to any significant cuts as some people would like to see. In terms of demands in the forestry budget, well, if my memory serves me correctly, it's not that long ago we were struggling to spend the budget due to the lack of applications coming in. There's a variety of economic factors out there that influence the degree to which there's take-up of the forestry budget. And as I said before, thankfully, at the moment, or over the last year or two, it's largely improved and there's been a bigger take-up, and we're much more likely to achieve our targets for tree planting. So it's looking better, and if that continues, no doubt, then there might be a bigger demand in the forestry budget which we can't meet, and that will be a sign of success because everyone wants to plant trees and everything's moving along swimmingly. So we'll just cope with that when it happens. There's always an ability within the Rural Development Programme, as you know from past experience, to shift the budgets, and we always adapt where the demand is, outstripping supply. We'll try and deal with that if there's spare capacity in other budgets. So we just have to keep our eye on that and keep it under review. But forestry is becoming increasingly important, and you mentioned Patrick Krauser talking about the carbon reduction requirements. forestry should not be and is not only about the rural development budget. You know, there's other incentives for forestry. Clearly, with control of the tax system, we could look at that as well. But in terms of carbon offsetting initiatives and other initiatives we have to promote in Scotland to find other ways of financing tree planting, you know, they're important as well. It's not just about the budget heading within Pillar 2 of the Rural Development Programme. We have to find other ways of encouraging investment in forestry in Scotland. Thank you.
Okay, on that point. Moving on to ELFAS at the moment. Cabinet Secretary, there's been a number of comments about the flawed nature of the scheme, the large size of its part in Pillar 2, the potential to see it as Pillar 1 in disguise, as Stuart Goodall said. Can you tell us, you know, why you propose to spend a third of the Scotland Rural Development Programme budget on ELFAS?
Well, experience has taught us over the last few years that ELFAS remains a very important scheme for farming and cropping businesses in Scotland. And of course it helps inject investment into farming activity in parts of Scotland where there's additional challenges. Scotland, we have to remind ourselves, has 85% less favoured area status, and it's the opposite the case south of the border, whereas around 15–16% of land, give or take, is less favoured area status. So that just puts into context the scale of the challenges facing agriculture activity in Scotland. And the ELFAS clearly is viewed as a very important support mechanism by Scottish agriculture. We're committed to that. It might not be perfect and it may require to be reviewed. We have, of course, said that right now is not the right time to do that because we're implementing a new Common Agricultural Policy and the amount of work that would be involved in reshaping and redesigning the ELFAS at the moment, you know, we just put us in an untenable position. We couldn't do that and implement a new Common Agricultural Policy. So we've got until 2018 under European rules or plans to review ELFAS. It's going to happen, but we've got until 2018. And there'll be an opportunity to refine it, better target it, etc., if that's what's required once the new Common Agricultural Policy is implemented. So that's the sort of way forward as far as we see it.
I'm trying to get an overview of a package that hill farmers could see themselves getting, of what crofters might see themselves getting overall out of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And the ELFAS bit is the bit that they perhaps most complain about, and that it isn't targeted at the least favoured areas. Now, you've told us we're not going to have a third, likely to have a third section of, you know, dealing with rough grazing. How can we see ELFAS in terms of the reconfiguration? Is it going to actually move towards least favoured rather than less favoured?
Well, that was my argument of better targeting. You know, one of the big debates just now is that it should be better targeted. And all I'm saying is, well, I can't sit here with the answers of defining better targeting, is that, you know, there is obviously a view out there it needs to be better targeted. Therefore, we will undertake a review, but it just won't happen just now for the reasons I outlined earlier. And in terms of the third region, I'm not quite sure how you were phrasing that there. I'll just make clear that we have said we are looking at a third region. So it's not the opposite. I wasn't maybe I picked you up wrongly there, but it's just to, in case there was a misunderstanding. We're just saying there's factors to take into account before we take a final decision whether there should be a third region. But we've agreed to look at it seriously.
Okay. Just thought I would probe it along those lines. About looking at new entrant support in Pillar 2, Cara Hilton.
Again, just on this, as a committee we heard evidence that subsidising people to go into farming is very expensive. For example, Professor Bill Slee told the committee that all the evidence suggests that it's extremely difficult to design efficient policies to get people into farming when the entry costs are so high. So, I mean, you hinted at the answer to this in your introductory statement, but why, given that there is evidence that it's not a very efficient policy, why is the government going down the road of providing start-up grants to new entrants?
Well, I've always made it a priority to help new entrants, and we have undertaken a number of different initiatives to try and encourage new entrants into the sector. So, on the positive side, there are new entrants who have come into agriculture over the last few years, and many of them have benefited in one shape or form from some government support. But on the negative side, of course, there are still huge challenges in terms of the cost of land, access to land, access to tenancies, the cost of capital equipment, the cost of livestock. There's big, big challenges that we fully accept are there. So we felt it was better to have some scheme rather than no scheme in the Rural Development Programme. And there has been take-up. We've invested several £1 million over the last few years and quite a lot of new entrants. So when I speak to those new entrants, they've found the help invaluable, and it has made a difference. But I accept that if you really want to make a transformational change to new entrants to Scotland and have the next generation, literally thousands of new farmers coming into farming over the next few years, we do need some radical solutions. I accept that. And clearly our agricultural holdings review groups looking at the ability to create new tenancies and all the issues surrounding that, because that's usually the first rung in the ladder for a new entrant, is getting a tenancy. And of course, access to single farm payment, or the new payments through the new scheme under the new cap, is important, because in the past they've been frozen out. So there's some chinks of light out there, good chinks of light. We're doing new things with government policy in terms of publicly owned land being used for new tenancies. We've got the reviews underway. We've got the new Common Agricultural Policy that will give support to new entrants. And we've got the new Rural Development Programme, where we'll continue some support for new entrants as well. So, there's things like the cost of land we perhaps can't influence, but we're trying to help in any way we can.
I think you kind of answered this in the comments you made, Cabinet Secretary, but it would be good to get this absolutely on the record, because during the evidence sessions we had, there was a question mark raised about whether the €70,000 grant would cover livestock acquisition as well as machinery, equipment and upgrading of buildings. Can you just confirm that is the case?
I'll ask David if we can remember if the livestock's included. I'm just going to ask David to come in at this point, because we've been working on this.
Yes, I think we should double check and absolutely confirm what the proposal was in the consultation document. Of course, the consultation document isn't the decision. The Cabinet Secretary will in time sign off the precise decision, which may or may not be precisely the same as what was in the consultation document, but we should come back to the committee to confirm what was in to confirm what the proposal was, and in due course, when the programme is finalised, that will become an absolute decision.
Welcome, because there was that question raised in the
No, you should just put it on a radar, so it's a good thing to do.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Support for collaboration. Claudia Beamish.
Secretary, we've heard at a previous evidence session about support for collaboration, although it was highlighted that in some people's definition, cooperation was a more clearly defined issue, but I don't want to nitpick about it. We heard about support for flooding, for instance, and other agri-environment things where people are working together in the agriculture sector. But James Withers of Scottish Food and Drink had said, and I quote, that agri-food cooperatives were the unsung heroes of the food and drink industry. And also Stuart Ainsworth sought clarification on whether cooperation or collaboration measures were only aimed at landscape management, or whether it could go beyond that. I wonder if you could give us any hints about your thoughts on that.
Well, one of the key motivations for promoting collaboration in Pillar 2 is at the landscape scale. And I remember being on Lewis, it must be 4 years ago, give or take now, and I met a group of crofters who, I think, if I remember the story correctly, had individually found it quite challenging to apply for some support to do some agri-environment schemes, but they then come together collectively and got support for a joint scheme. And it's these kind of projects we want to promote, because clearly, if you're trying to address a landscape issue, and there's several players involved in that landscape, it's much more effective to have everyone on board working together and getting a jointly funded project to help address the challenge in that landscape than having one or two crofters or farmers getting into an individual scheme. So we think that's certainly a way forward in terms of addressing landscape issues. And in terms of James Withers and his issue of cooperation, clearly through the food budgets, we're doing our best to promote collaboration and cooperation, because many other countries have been much more successful at farmer cooperatives or food producer cooperatives than we have been in Scotland, where it's been a wee bit against the nature, perhaps, of too many food producers or farmers in the past. Maybe just not part of our culture to the same degree as other countries. But I think that's now changing, and obviously the dairy sector in particular is looking at these sort of issues, and the dairy review addressed cooperation. But that applies to all primary production. We need to support and promote cooperation and collaboration.
We move on to CAGs. There's been quite a bit of criticism, both from the NFU and from the Crofting Federation, about the proposal that seems to wish to extend CAGs to small farms, which could amount to some 34,000 units in Scotland. And there's some analysis of the Scottish Government officials look at this, which seems illogical and disconnected in terms of the analysis. Do you agree that it would be easier to keep a scheme for CAGs in the areas defined for crofting in the 2010 Act?
Yes.
And therefore, the question about the amount of money in the proposed scheme is the next question we have to look at.
Yes. Well, I mean, I met the Scottish Crofting Federation just last week or last 10 days, and clearly this was an issue they were exercised about, understandably. I mean, I think there's been a slight misunderstanding over the issue, but when I looked at it closely, I can see exactly why there has been a misunderstanding. Therefore, I need to be upfront and just say, OK, we just have to sort this out. And I can see the case for just separating the fund into a small farmers fund and a continuation of the fund for the crofters. So I am inclined to do that following the consultation, which is now closed for Pillar 2. And in terms of the budget, clearly I'll just look at that, what the budget should be. But I fully accept the understanding or the concern that opening up the scheme to thousands of small farmers could, in theory, dilute it to such an extent that it loses its impact. And I don't want that to happen. We'll probably just refine to ensure that we are targeting the right small farmers for that fund once it's set up. I'll have to take a decision on what the actual budgets are, of course, but this is for a genuine reason, because there are small farmers who are similar to the crofters in terms of the challenges to face, but because they're not in crofting counties and they're not crofters, there wasn't an easily accessible fund for them. And I think we have to provide some sort of support for them. So that was the intention and sentiment behind the original proposal.
I welcome, your immediate answer about the protection of the CAGs to the crofting areas. It is a matter of land reform whether indeed there should be one form of tenure which is under discussion in the crofting sump about the small farmers and the crofters who sit side by side in the various tenures that there are, which restrict the way in which we can think. But fundamentally, it was put that 30% was the increase roughly in the funds which you had identified, but a 400% increase in the potential recipients. So I think it's therefore going to be of interest to the crofters to know how much of the 30% increase would be targeted at crofting. And we look forward to the answer to that if you can't give it to us now, as soon as possible. Looking at the overall package for crofting, that's the kind of things that they feel they know. But would you say, therefore, that in your view, in this discussion we've had about the various elements to do with crofting, that they're not heading for a hit on what they get, but in fact that the various elements together make a package that's very viable?
I'm confident there'll be a good package of support for crofters in Scotland. And whilst, yes, there's a big debate of whether the focus of farming funds should shift from the good land to the poorer lands, we've already discussed there's other factors you have to take into account as well. But whatever that debate may result in, I'm confident that we will show that we are committed to crofting and that there will be a substantial array of support mechanisms for the sector, so that our crofting sectors can continue to make a really good contribution to both food production, caring for landscapes and our local crofting communities.
Well, thanks very much for that. I want to move on to process issues now. Nigel Dawn.
I apologise to you, the committee, and indeed the Cabinet Secretary for my coming and going over the last couple of hours on other parliamentary business. If I could turn, please, to the Rural Regional Delivery Partnership and the processes whereby funds are applied for and eventually awarded, of course. As I understand it, the proposal is that there will be two levels with a cut-off point at £75,000, except for forestry. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware of a specific suggestion from the NFU that there might be three levels, including a very much lower cut-off point for ones that were dealt with very locally. I'm just wondering whether Cabinet Secretary could add anything to what's already in the consultation and how he's minded to go. There plainly is something to be said for quite small sums of money just being dealt with locally by people who know the local layout and would know how much sense it makes.
Yes, clearly I've listened closely to views on the complexity and timescales involved in applying to the Rural Development Programme we had from 2007 onwards. And I therefore said I'm determined to simplify the process, and the number of entry levels for funds is part of that, so that a fund for X does not have to go through the same bureaucracy and long timeline and checks and clearance from various levels of government compared to what used to happen before. And that's obviously going to simplify the process greatly, because clearly the smaller the grant, the more there are of them. Therefore you can tackle a lot of applications if you raise the threshold of those that don't have to go through the long drawn-out clearance process. So it's about simplification and making the process easier. I'm confident that will definitely be the outcome. There is a debate about how many different levels of grants there should be and what level of process each one should go through. I would remind the committee, of course, that even a grant of £5,000 or £10,000 is still a generous level of support that you or I can't qualify for, but farming businesses and rural businesses are able to qualify for through Pillar 2 for good reasons. But that is public money, so we always have to strike that balance of making sure that it's public money, it's held to account, it's audited, it's been used for the right purposes, and there's a good outcome from that investment for the public purse, with the fact that we don't want to be overly bureaucratic and complicated. I think we'll be a lot further down that road of simplification and making things a bit easier.
Right, thank you. You have, in terms of the whole overall policy, given us various dates that we know things will start to kick in. Obviously, payments from 2015 and the new entrants receiving money at that point. The LFAS review in 2018. The area payments proposals, implemented the year after that. There's been a bit of a talk about the 2016 assessment of the budget allocations. And I wonder, how much comfort can be derived from the UK government's commitment to review the CAP budget allocations in 2016. Can we assume in relation to the next cap, when there's a whole range of practical imponderables, such as the lead partner in the UK opposing, in principle, direct payments, UK general election in 2015 that could change the government. Scotland could be an independent country by then. if the present government's re-elected, it's committed to an in-out referendum. With all these imponderables, you know, what store can we put on some people's backstop of this 2016 review of the CAP?
Well, I don't believe there's any case whatsoever for placing any stock by the UK Government's commitment to review the budget allocations. You've very eloquently outlined some of the reasons why I think that's the case. This was a decision that has been taken in the last few months. It was a wrong decision not to give Scotland the convergence uplift that only came to the UK in the first place because of Scotland's low payments. Therefore, 100% of the 220 or thereabouts million euros should have come to Scotland and allowed us to have more of a budget to invest in the future of our rural economy as part of this process. It's utterly shameful that didn't happen. It's inexcusable, indefensible. I'm really disappointed the Scotland Office in particular didn't stand up to DEFRA on this issue, especially given that Alistair Carmichael, his own constituents, Northern and Shetland, are really badly affected by this daylight robbery of Scottish agricultural funds. However, we are where we are, but the one remaining issue, of course, is that the UK Government are holding out the fig leaf of this review in 2016. It's a review in 2016, it's not a change to the formula. The review could take 1, 2, 3 years, we don't know. And what's really important is that Owen Paterson has told me the implementation of whatever the results of that review, if it happens, will not occur until after 2020, the next Common Agricultural Policy, after the one we're discussing today, the new financial period. So the budget overall in Europe will be up for discussion and debate and negotiation, never mind the convergence uplift, which he says he may decide to change the internal distribution of in 2017 or thereabouts, which will not be implemented until after 2020 anyway. So it's all very murky. It's a red herring as far as I'm concerned. I've got a letter here that Owen Paterson sent me with the decision about the convergence uplift, and he says in it, in 2016 there will be a review of the functioning of the multi-annual financial framework. It is my intention at the same time to initiate a review of the internal allocation of UK CAP funds, aiming to conclude by 2017, to help inform our approach to domestic allocations for the next period. The next period, i.e. post-2020. So the idea we're going to get 1 penny from the money that's been kept back from Scotland with the convergence uplift between now and 2020, I think, is a non-starter. It's a great pity.
Thank you very much for that very clear set of answers.
I should also add, I mentioned Croatia earlier on. I'm sorry to labour the point, but I was asking for some information on Croatia, the new member state. Their Pillar 1 payments overtake Scotland in 2017. So a new entrant to Europe not only gets 20 times what we get per hectare under Pillar 2, they negotiated that with Europe, but their Pillar 1 payments overtake Scotland in 2017, as I understand it.
Yep.
And from the time Croatia decided to join Europe and to them actually joining Europe, how long that was, do we know?
Well, my point is that Scotland's in Europe, and the UK
no, I was
has been...
asking about Croatia, I wasn't asking about...
Well, I don't see how that's relevant, because they joined Europe last year, and already by 2017 their Pillar 1 payments are going to overtake Scotland's, and they only joined Europe last year, and already their rural development funds are going to be 20 times the Scottish rate. So it just shows how badly Scotland fares by allowing our negotiations to be carried out on our behalf by another government who've got different priorities. That is the UK government, given the contrast between the Irelands, the Denmarks, the Croatias, the Finlands, and Scotland's dire position.
Any further points on that? You made your point of view very clear. I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for their detailed answers. It finished slightly remarkably earlier than I thought, but that's only because we managed to get through Pillar 2 more quickly, I guess, than I'd expected. But we've got very detailed answers, a lot to mull over, and I would thank the Cabinet Secretary and his team for their contribution just now. As we agreed earlier, we'll shortly move this session into private, but before that, the details of our next meeting are that on the 2nd of April, we'll consider a petition on wild geese, its climate change mainstreaming and its future work programme. I end the open session now and ask the public gallery to be cleared.